Today on Co-op for Two, a deep dive review of the Time Stories Revolution series. What works, what doesn't, and why? Let's find out. Let me start by telling you what this review will cover. I'm going to be mostly spoiler-free, although there may be times when I jump into a couple things that those of you who are real sticklers may want to avoid. When I do, I'll give you a warning and you can use timestamps to jump around. I will talk about the series as a whole, and then I will review and rank each of the main boxes, and then talk about the Experience add-on campaign box, and all of this will be with an eye towards game design issues. So what is Time Stories Revolution? It's a card-based adventure narrative exploration game with some RPG elements, an occasional puzzle element, and a little bit of resource and time management. There are currently 3 standalone boxes, The Hadal Project, Midsummer Night, and Cavendish, and then a little optional campaign legacy expansion. These are all a couple years old, and there's some unknown about whether the series has been abandoned or whether Space Cowboys intends to eventually reboot it. This is the second reboot of Time Stories, so I'm not sure what the future holds. Each of the standalone boxes can be purchased now in 2024 for somewhere between $10 and $20, depending on sale. Each box will take you maybe 2 to 3 hours to play through. They play fine solo, maybe ideal at 2-player, go up to 4. There's no real replayability, very minor, but essentially you're meant to play through this once in one sitting, possibly 2 if you do very badly, and then that's it. But nothing gets destroyed, so you could pass it along or trade it when you're finished. Let's talk about the original Time Stories first. The original Time Stories was released in around 2015, was developed for 4 years or so, and has 8 official expansions and a lot more fan expansions. It was a base box, and then you could get expansions that use the base box. It was a divisive game. Some people really loved it. Others, like me, were not so thrilled with it. It had many of the same features of these small Time Stories Revolution boxes in that it was heavy on narrative and exploration with this time travel theme throughout, and a little bit of role-playing element to it. But one of the things that differentiated Time Stories, the original, from this set, if you look at the evolution of the systems, one of the main differences was that Time Stories seemed to be designed so that you would have to replay it multiple times. That is, you would play it, you would make mistakes and die and fail the mission, and then knowing what places not to go and what things not to do, you would play it again and again and again until you solved it. There was also a very strict time limit system. The resource was time, so that you would run out of time, you wouldn't be able to finish the mission, and that would again force you to replay it. I was unhappy with that aspect of Time Stories. I did not want to keep replaying, going through the same motions. It felt very grindy, very unpleasant to have to redo stuff that I knew how it was going to go and go through all the mechanics. And I don't particularly love being forced to run out of time through no fault, no deductive elements caused you to make bad decisions that made you run out of time and fail. It was just the nature of the game. And I'll talk a little bit more about how they've streamlined the system in the development of Time Stories Revolution. So let's talk a little bit about what's different about Time Stories Revolution. Time Stories Revolution series was released in 2020 as an evolution of Time Stories. Sometimes they call this the Blue Cycle. The last box, I think, was Cavendish here in 2023, so it hasn't been that long, but there really is radio silence from Space Cowboys about whether there will ever be another box, and people have been asking for a while. No one seems to know. I think it's fair to call this a streamlining of the Time Stories system, but other changes are that there's no more base game and expansions. Each box here is a standalone box. You can play them in any order. They are definitely less punishing. They're almost all card-based. There are some tokens in each box that are unique for that box, and each box introduces a small mechanic or two that's unique. But it's much more of each box is a little bit bespoke in terms of changing of rules and changing of tokens. But there is a common mechanic of skill tests and exploration, and we'll look at all that in a second. But there's also been a big change in terms of simplifying the resource management. It's no longer a strict time resource allocation. You don't run out of time and fail. You've got these little crystals, magic crystals, that are used for everything now. And they do put some pressure in terms of time to explore. You have to spend a crystal for each action and for improving your tests. But there's a much more generous system here for if you run out. If you run out, there's a way of you resetting your supply. And essentially the punishment for that, for all intents and purposes, is just a worse score. That completely changes the way you play through this, because when you run out of your resources, you basically just say, okay, we're going to reset our resources, don't have to restart the game. We'll get a slightly worse score, but then we can keep playing. And it does mean that for most of these boxes, you will be able to finish them on the first playthrough. And in the original Time Stories, there's some real lore behind this time travel thing. In fact, there was a novel written about it and a continuing storyline underneath the original Time Stories boxes, one that not everyone was thrilled about. Here we basically have no underlying backstory in the boxes. It's all been relegated to this experience expansion box that tries to provide a broader narrative that connects these games. I'll talk about why I think that fails so miserably at the end. But within the boxes, they are standalone experiences. So let's take a look at the mechanics and the components here. In the first box, the Hadal Project, if you really care about this stuff, you could use timestamps to jump around. But I'm not going to show you anything that you wouldn't see right when you start the game. The first thing to notice is all of the boxes have one little token sheet. And that token sheet has some damage counters, but then it has a whole bunch of other counters that are secrets. And it's telling you, don't look at the other side of these. These might be items you find or conditions as you go around to keep track of some, if you get injured or if you meet someone, all this stuff. And they all have their own bespoke set of tokens. Then we've got the one resource that's managed in this series, which are these Azrak magic crystals. And one of the things the game does is balances player count by dividing up, giving you a different amount of these to divide up. And then all the boxes have this same set of 3 decks of cards. You've got the story cards, which represent locations that you explore. You've got common cards, which are like items and a couple other things. And you've got these personal cards, which are a totally new add-on to the Time Stories system. So let me show you these so you can get a feel. Now, each of these boxes has a different artist, but all of the art is consistently very high quality and very good. In fact, I'm just going to rifle through these so you get some idea of the kind of art you're looking at. All right, now let's look at the first couple cards here. Each of the boxes gives you 4 characters to choose from. If you were playing 4 players, everyone would get 1. Otherwise, you divide, pick whichever group you want, a subset you want to play with. The solo rules are essentially 2-player rules. You have to play with 2 characters, but it's really not hard to keep track of. Let's take a look at what a character looks like here. So each of the characters has 3. There's always 3 skills. All of the tests are comprised 3 skills, and they have slightly different values for each of them, and then a starting number of crystals, and then maybe a special power. All right. Then we've got a little reminder sheets, and then each of these games starts you out in a little prologue location. So this is just the location you would see when you start. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. You've got a starting card that's going to tell us about this location. And then we've got a panorama that has a beautiful illustration on the back. So every time this whole deck is made up of different locations. In fact, in the beginning, when you start, you're given a map. So there's the map we start out with. As you play these games, these maps you'll discover more regions, and sometimes cards will get replaced as you discover new locations on a card. So the mechanic is the same. You decide to travel to a location on the map. You put a crystal, you spend a resource, a crystal, you put it where you want to go, and then you grab out the panorama for that location, and then you read the A card for that location, which sometimes has special rules, but otherwise tells you about what you're seeing here. And then you'll take turns going to a place and reading what you see there at that location. And sometimes there's little bit of deduction, like you might see some dangerous thing, you don't want to go there. Occasionally you'll get to a location, you won't have enough resources to visit every place, so you'll have to figure out which places are most important for us. A major part of the game is trying to intuit which person should go where. So because your different characters are better at different skills, let's find a more dramatic difference here. So here you've got someone who's very bad at physical strength. So probably if you saw on the card there was some creature to fight or some heavy object to lift, you wouldn't have this person go there. You'd have someone else go there. And it's all cooperative. You decide as a group who goes where. There's some mechanic if you're playing with multiple players where when someone reads a card, they can't just show it to the group. They have to explain what they see. I played these games mostly solo, so I can't vouch for that. If your group didn't want to play like that, you could just keep the cards open and on the table. So I don't want to show you any of the kinds of things you see in locations because that would be spoiling stuff. But I can show you a little bit in the rule book what tests look like. All right, so that's what I've just ran through about going to a location, visiting places. Occasionally, not infrequently, you'll turn over a card that has a test on it. Like you've encountered someone And the color in the center tells you what kind of a test it is. So it's a red test, it's a strength test. And you see what score you have to match. And then you see what happens if you fail the test, if you can't reach that score, what happens if you succeed, and what happens if you succeed exactly, which is a critical success, which is better. So there is some strategy where you're trying to get the score exactly. The way you pass a test is you add your base score, and then you spend any crystals you want to spend to increase your score. In this case, we'd have to add 4 crystals to get from 1 to 5. Other players, if they're not busy, can help you, can contribute their tokens. They can't contribute their score values. And then one of the other changes to the Time Story system is the original Time Stories had a die. And it was painful because you could frequently fail tests due to a die roll. You couldn't fix it. You couldn't do anything to ameliorate your chances. And the die roll was even used when you traveled just to eat up more time randomly. It was, in my view, a very unpleasant, unwanted source of randomness. Here we've got a much more controlled thing. First of all, you can use these tokens to increase your score. And then you've got a deck of destiny cards, and these are basically modifiers. And the back shows you what they range between. And you can see there's +1, -1, +2, 0, -2, -1. So you shuffle these up, and when you try to pass a test, this is your modifier that you add to your score. You know they go from -2 to +2. And when you draw one, it gets put aside, so you get a little better understanding of what the deck is. So as you play now, you know that the only thing left in this deck are -1s and +1s until it resets. So you have a much better sense of what the likely random modifiers are. Because this resource is not so precious, you're basically in a situation where if you want to guarantee you will pass a test, you can almost always do it. It's just it may be very inefficient, and you'll be encouraged to push your luck. If you know that most of the cards here are -1s, there's 1 -2, you might say, okay, let's just get above by 1, and there's only a 20% chance we're going to fail this test. It makes things much more, it makes it much more possible to do informed pushing of your luck. And when there's a really important task, then you overspend on crystals to guarantee it. That's a very smart way to do things. That's a classic push your luck recipe, and it works very well here. So one of the challenges you encounter is when you confront a test, you're asking yourself, how important is it that we pass this? If it's very important, then we should just spend all the resources to guarantee it. And then what's the chance of us failing? And you can reason about that probability fairly well. That's a major change to the Time Story system and very welcome. It's something we see in Seven Citadel and other adventure games. It works very well. Now, in addition to these one-off tests, occasionally you get locked tests. These tend to be sort of showdowns. There tend to be 1 or 2 in each box where it's like a battle to the death. Most of the tests you could walk away from. If a person with low strength drew this card, they could just say, okay, I'm not going to be the person that tries to open this door. I'll put it back. You go and you grab it. A little inefficient, but the best person can tackle it. But occasionally you get tests that are locked in, usually for the whole group. And then the group has to have this fight. That's the one place that the group could die if you get unlucky. And I'll come back to that in a second. But those tend to be fights where you inflict a little bit of damage on the enemy each step. And then it only ends when you defeat the enemy. And then we've got a whole bunch of item cards, which I don't really want to show you, but I can just skim through it so you can get a look at the art and stuff and the variation of things. Basically, as you go around, you might pick up objects. You might pick up new changes to the map. Sometimes you can use those objects. Sometimes they give you increased skills, etc. And then you'll be instructed occasionally to go grab a specific token. Frequently, you won't know what it will do till the time comes. And that's basically the way the game works. Eventually, you'll get to the end. It'll typically be because finally a new location gets revealed through other actions. Then you'll be able to go to that location. You'll have a little showdown. Maybe you'll have to solve a little bit of a mystery, not in the form of answering questions, but just in the form of what you do. Maybe a final battle. And then you'll read some finale wrap-up. Okay, let's talk about another addition to the Revolution series that was not found in the original Time Stories, which is quite brilliant. So there's this small deck of personal cards, and basically it's a mini deck for each of the potentially playable 4 characters. So each character that you can play has their own deck. Always 4 then in these series. All right, so now when you pick which characters you're going to play, you take their decks. Each player gets their deck, the rest won't get used. And in these decks, there's 2 special cards and then a set of interaction cards, in this case 12 of them. One of these cards gives you an item or a skill, further differentiating the characters from each other. The other item you're supposed to keep secret from the group, I guess, but it's called a snap memory. And it's basically, the whole theme of this game is you are time travelers inhabiting the body of a person in some place different in time. So you've got sort of your memories and their memories mashed together. This little card tells you a little bit about some memory you have of the person you're inhabiting. A little bit of their backstory or a trauma or an issue. And this card that tells you about that is sort of a hint to the kinds of things you should be looking for as you explore. And what happens is you'll get a card. Maybe this card says you had some relationship with someone, let's say you had some relationship with your father, you wish you could repair it. So as you'll be playing, maybe you'll come across something in some location that sounds related to that. And you'll have opportunities to talk to people. So occasionally you'll put out a location and the group will see someone sitting at a bar or something, and any of the players could go talk to them. And when a player talks to another character or does some action, the game will say, the card you're exploring will say, go read your personal interaction card 4. And whatever player chose to do that would then go get personal interaction card 4 and read it. And that'll be a dialogue customized for that character. So there's 12 different interaction cards, and there's 12 for each player, and each one is dealing with a specific encounter. So let's say there's someone sitting at a bar, a drunk person sitting at a bar, and when you interact with them, that triggers you to get interaction card 4. So this player's interaction card 4 will be this player's talking to that drunk. Then this player's interaction card 4 is this player talking to that drunk, and so on for all 4. So when you encounter someone that you think might have a personal history with a specific character you're playing with, usually you want that person to go talk to them. So there is a little bit of strategy around recognizing when you have a location in front of you, thinking, hey, what's the right person to send over there? Not just because they might be better at the test that's required, but maybe one of our characters will be able to have a better interaction with this person. Maybe one person is better at convincing people of things, so we should send them there so that if they happen to have an interaction dialogue, that's the right person to have that dialogue. And sometimes there'll be negative consequences if you send the wrong person to talk to the wrong person. It's a very, very clever system. It essentially gives you all these different variations on dialogues and discussions, because now you've got 12 for each person. So you've got 48 different little mini interactions, all of them depending on what character. So each little interaction is customized for that character. It's a very clever system. It definitely increases the narrative feel of it and gives each character their own little backstory and storyline that they can pursue while they go. I'm not sure I've seen this before, this idea that the interaction card says grab interaction card 4 and they all have different variations on it. I'm not sure I've seen that before, and it is extremely clever. Continuing our discussion of some of the more subtle gameplay mechanics here, there are some clever things going on with efficiency and multiplayer. I think that's the key motivational thing that's governing most of the decisions you make. It is efficiency here, since you can most of the time reset if you need to, if you run out of these tokens and get a better get a worse score as the penalty. But there are some more efficiency things happening. One of them has to do with multiplayer coordination. So I said how there's a decision being made of deciding who to send where, and if you make that decision wrong, most of the time you won't be able to know what's behind a card, but you can use a little bit of intuition and guessing about who to send where. So if the wrong person goes somewhere, most of the time they can just leave and have the other person go there. It's a little bit inefficient because it costs you a Azrak magic crystal every time you change where you go. But there is also another little element here, which is that when you go to a place, each player has their own items. When you find an item, that person who found it keeps it. So they've got different items that might help them with different encounters and tests. And the rule is that between locations, you can trade items, reorganize them, decide who has what for free. When you're in an encounter, when you're going to a place, then that changes. And other people can't just use their items when you have a test or give you items. You can do it, but it's a cost. It costs you 1 crystal each time you want to give one item to another player. And then there's a little minor rule about how if someone's not engaged with a card, they can help, but if they are engaged with a card, they can't help. It's a clever little efficiency thing, because it does mean that every time before you go to a new location, you have a little discussion. Hey, how should we divvy up these items? How are they more likely to be used? Who's going to need what more likely? But then when you get to a place, you can do a little bit of audible changes and say, okay, well, you don't have the right thing, but maybe it's worth the cost to get you this one card. That little theme of trying to be efficient as you play and anticipate things does add to the enjoyment and the feeling of some strategy in the game. And then there's this issue of resetting when you run out of these crystals. And it's the one area where there's a little bit of danger. And it's a little convoluted. Once you get used to it, you'll figure it out. But so everyone's got their own supply of these crystals in front of them, and they get spent as you travel, and they get spent during tests. All right. You're always at a location, right? We saw that first location. We saw that first location that was out here. All right, now. So you're spending these crystals as you go and deal with tests, and then inevitably you're in a location, you get down to where you have only a couple crystals left. Then it starts to become a little scary, because you might get trapped in some test where you don't have enough crystals. So I'm going to come back to this issue of having to play it safe with crystals. But if a person runs out of their last crystal, they've got a choice. They can either do this emergency update just for themselves, and they basically go to the supply and refill their crystals. There's a little bit of a cost to that in terms of your score, but that is an inefficient thing to do, because the most efficient way for everyone to recycle their crystals is that when you finish with a location, everyone can fill up for one action, everyone can fill up to their baseline. So that's what you want to do. You're encouraged, for the sake of efficiency, to always be doing a group update, not an emergency update. So again, that's that efficiency thing of encouraging you to push your luck so that you do things efficiently. That's a very clever way to let players self-balance the difficulty of the game, because it's not these inefficient things. You don't want to do them because they're going to hurt your score, and it feels stupid to do something that's inefficient. But that pushes you to take more risks than you would normally take. Then there's the other thing where if you run out of crystals, that player can just say, okay, I'm kicked out. I'm going to lose control of my receptacle until you guys finish with this location. Sometimes that's a little bit of a strategic decision to play. If everyone loses all of their crystals in a location, then the game ends. Then you've lost and you have to replay it. Now, we played all three of these boxes. We never let that happen to us, but it could happen. And it could happen during one of these showdowns where you're locked into a test. And I'm going to come back to that. I think that's the one sort of flaw in this system, that you could get into a situation where everyone's going to die through no fault of their own. That could happen towards the end of the game, and you, according to the rules, have to replay it. But we'll come back to that. There's a lot to love here with Time Stories Revolution. First of all, we should take some notice of the art. The art in each of these boxes is beautiful. It's each done by a different artist, but they are all in their own different way very beautiful, very enjoyable to play through. And that's important for a game that is really about exploration and discovery and discovering new fantastical things. Each of the themes and settings here are very different. One is sci-fi, one is sort of a haunted mansion, and one is a very fantasy literary adventure. It really is a wonderful set of games. Each of them, in their own way, has this real sense of wonder while you're exploring these strange new places. It's done very well. There's quite a sense of humor and tension in all of these. There's a little bit of sci-fi time travel in each of them, some more than others, but each of them have a little bit of it. Mechanically, I think there is a real shift in tone from the original Time Stories here. The original Time Stories felt more like a choose-your-own-adventure book where you're meant to, the first few times you play each mission, you have no idea what to do. You just stumble into it, die, get bad luck, and then when you replay it over and over and over again, you do things slightly differently, which matches with the theme of time travel. We've seen lots of time travel movies where that's what you have to do, keep replaying it till you figure it out. I don't find that particularly fun. Here, really the whole shift has been towards push your luck and efficiency. Throughout, whether it's the tests, drawing these destiny card modifiers, whether it's the running out of tokens and doing these efficient or inefficient updates, whether it's organizing who has what items efficiently versus inefficiently, choosing who goes where efficiently or inefficiently. It's all sort of push your luck efficiency. And to me, that's really welcome. That is a sweet spot for this kind of game for me. For exploration, narrative, adventure games, I do think that is the winning mechanic. And There's also, with most of these 3 boxes, one core little element that's a little bit deduction and puzzle. It's not like an escape room game. It's not really a deduction game. You'll frequently be doing things where there's no real way to figure out what the right thing to do is. But it feels to me like there's a real effort in most of these 3 boxes, I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about each of them, to have a core little mystery deductive element that you do have to figure out and think about how you're going to solve. And that's a very welcome addition here. Now, for me, there's only one real negative here. And it's not a showstopper. It's sort of shocking to me how bad it is, though. Not including the experience box. That's its own different kind of bad. But there's something very jarring that happens in each of these boxes. And that is the combat. It doesn't happen often. In each box, there's 1 or 2 big combat moments. And we need to talk about it a little bit because I think it works. It's done very poorly here. I think it's a terrible mechanical system. And I recognize that it's difficult to pull off. And it's some of this is my bias against that in these kinds of games. And I've not found a game that does it perfectly. Whether you're talking about Seven Citadel, Seven Continent, which does share a bit in common here in terms of focusing on adventure and exploration. But that's another game where combat is the least enjoyable, most fiddly, most busy work, sort of slows to a crawl. Here, though, it's particularly disappointing. And I think we need to talk about why. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what combat looks like in Time Stories Revolution. Most of what you're doing is exploring, meeting strange people, having interactions with them, trying to figure out how something mechanically works with some interesting consequences. And then there's combat. And the way combat frequently works here is you're looking at some location, like, okay, I'll go here, I'll look in this cupboard, or I'll go here and I'll look behind this drawer, or whatever. Or I'll go over the hill and see what that sound is. And every once in a while, you'll turn over a card and it'll say, oh my God, you've got to fight this giant creature. It'll have a lock on it, meaning you can't do anything else. And frequently it'll have a group lock. Like, okay, this is a big giant creature the group has to fight. You had no warning that you were going to be encountering this creature. If you happen to draw that card when you were low on crystals, you're basically in a terrible situation because you can't leave, you can't stop the fight, you had no warning it was coming, and you got very unlucky that you were everyone was low on resources. So now you'll have to do a whole bunch of super inefficient updates or you'll all die and have to replay the game. This could happen 3 hours into the game. Now, what does a combat look like? Well, frequently when you get into a combat, it'll say, go into this deck and grab the card for this monster. And that card will frequently be like, here's a picture of the monster, and here are the 3 ways you can attack it. You can do a strength attack, which has a test of 5 and does 2 damage. Or you can do a dexterity attack, which has a strength of 4 and does 1 damage. Or you can try to talk them into something which has a test of 3 and does this damage. And the way these combats work, the rules are everyone has to take a turn at choosing one of those 3 attacks and performing it. They're frequently very tough, which I guess you could say is a good thing, but they're frequently like you might get unlucky and lose the entire thing. Only if you get very lucky will you be able to survive it. They're all just going through the motions. They frequently slow everything down for a half an hour because every time you do one of these attacks, you have to go in a circle, and you might have to go, every player has to go maybe 3 times. Each player has to do 3 attacks in order to stack up enough damage. Every single time you have to decide, how many crystals should I add to the test? What's the distribution of modifiers in this deck? What's more likely to come out? Every single thing and every single little attack has no narrative, no story. The enemy never strikes back. There's never anything interesting about the battle. It's just a long, slow, fiddly, punishing, oppressive, unpleasant sequence of combat rounds you have to do over and over again. And if you finally do defeat it, you just put the card away. There's no extra story that comes from defeating it. There's no extra story that comes from losing. There's nothing surprising that can happen. So in a game that's all about exploring, discovering, having adventures, having unexpected stuff happen, it is a complete diversion into mechanical busywork. It's not pleasant, it's not fun, it's not interesting. Nothing about it is enjoyable. And it's almost never a matter of being clever and figuring out how to cleverly solve it. You very rarely can use the items to make any noticeable difference. You can't prepare for it because the flavor of all of these combats are, once you turn over the card, you have to finish the battle before you can leave, and then you just defeat it. So it's a very strange set of decisions here. Like a little mini game that you don't want to have to play. And I think for the most part, they could have just gotten rid of those from the game completely, and there would be very little lost. I think there are other ways you could try to address it and try to make it better. I think one of the real problems is that this locking the players into this battle and giving no foreshadowing that they're going to be up against this, or at least nothing useful. And I think one of the ways you could try to improve that is if you didn't get locked into a battle. If every big battle you were allowed to get some look at what you were going to face, then you could figure out, well, okay, how do we prepare for this? Where can we go to get some item that will defeat this creature? Or let's figure out when we should attack it, when we're strong enough to attack it. The fact that you're getting rid of all of that ability to anticipate how you're going to encounter this, I think ruins the whole nature of being able to strategically take on these battles. Another way you could try to fix this is by having more interesting narrative, story, adventure involved in the fight. So we've seen some games that try to do this where the enemy has their own deck, so it's a little bit of learning its strategy, figuring out how to fight it, or some sort of choose your own adventure, different branches depending on how you do it. Maybe another way you might think of it is have the combat encounters that are meant to be these sort of showdowns use a system similar to the personal interaction cards, so that each player would have their own custom deck of interacting with that creature. So then you'd have to say, well, this player should do this kind of attack and then turn over their unique card that told a story of the interaction with that creature. It's a very unpleasant thing, the whole combat, and oftentimes with this kind of game, it's a little bit jarring because most of the time you're not fighting and trying to kill creatures, but here you are forced to these weird, unnarrative encounters that are all just about fighting. Strange, out of place. Really, I hope, if they do another evolution of this system, I think that combat stuff should be reworked. Here's another idea. If you're making a game that's about adventure and exploration, and you want to have these meaningful showdowns, these sort of end of act big productions that feel different and you're locked into it, what if instead of combat, it was a puzzle? Like, we play all these escape room games where there are puzzles to be figured out. What if when you turn over a card and you get locked into this event, what if you got locked into a puzzle that you then had to figure your way out of? I think that could work. I think it would capture the same flavor of there being a couple of these episodic, big, meaningful events. It's just that making it a puzzle makes it so that you can't get unlucky and get killed off because you didn't have enough resources. And you could make it narrative story based. All right, let's rank these boxes and talk about them. I'm going to go through them in my order from to most favorite, least favorite to most favorite. But I say least favorite, but I really like them all. So starting at the bottom of the ranking for me is the Hadal Project. Now, credit to the Hadal Project. This was a fan expansion that kicked off the whole Time Stories Revolution series. And of the people that played Time Stories Revolution with me, there wasn't agreement that this was on the bottom. Some people preferred this to my second choice. I would give this still a rating of 8 of 10. It's a very good game. It's got a real mystery puzzle-y thing at its core. It is, of the three of these games, the one that most really feels like a time travel story. The Hadal Project. It does properly set up the idea of sci-fi and time travel in a very enjoyable way. It's got a real 2-act system that's very compelling. There is very minor combat here. It is as unpleasant as I've talked about with the rest of these, but it's minor. And from my perspective, the actual storyline here is maybe the least interesting. But maybe for the most flavor of time travel, if you really want a time travel adventure, maybe Hadal Project. But I don't think this is a bad place to start. All right. Second, right in the middle for me, is Cavendish Manor. Cavendish Manor? This one says, the cover says Cavendish 1958. But other places it's been called Cavendish Manor. But this is a real haunted house story with sci-fi little twist. I rank this one a 9 of 10. I love the atmosphere and vibe. It really does capture the atmosphere of sort of a Cthulhu monster supernatural case. Completely different feel from the Hadal Project. A tiny bit of time travel story involved, but very minor. You would be forgiven for forgetting that there really was any time travel here at all. Very creepy, very atmospheric, very Cthulhu vibe. There are some places where you could get bad luck and be punished through no fault of your own, but I think maybe of the 3 boxes, that's least likely to happen here. I'm not sure there is much unfair combat in this one. This one felt much more like a creepy story. Then we've got Midsummer Night. Now, this is a strange one. This was my favorite experience of the set. I should say, took us 12 hours to play through this one. Won't take you 12 hours, but could definitely take you 3 or 4. All of them took 2 sessions, so all of them are probably in the 10 to 12 hour experience for me on the channel, but maybe in the 3 to 4 hour experience for you. And it needs to be said, that is longer than most of these card-based narrative adventure games. So these are long experiences. So back to A Midsummer Night. To me, this was a 10 out of 10. A very special game. And there are some very interesting things happening here. It is sort of a fantasy adventure exploration game, but it's particularly clever with lots of literary references, lots of very playful, tongue-in-cheek, sort of fourth wall breaking stuff. There's a real wink wink about time travel here. You're never quite sure what's going on. Sometimes it's disorienting, but sometimes it's incredibly charming and surprising. There are a couple of combat encounters here that are terrible, but this one really captures the feeling of being in a strange, sort of unpredictable world where every encounter you don't know, is this going to turn out to be great for us or is this going to be terrible? Every action, there's real trepidation. Is this going to kill us or is this going to get us some object that's going to be this wonderful, amazing thing? I would say this is the most creative box, the most surprising box. Now, I've seen the reviews of A Midsummer Night on Board Game Geek, and some people don't like it. And I can see how it could be a little disorienting and a little bit divisive. I think if it doesn't hit you in the right way, if it's not what you wanted or expected, I can see having an unpleasant time. Maybe if you're not catching some of the literary references, it might feel a little bit chaotic, random. You really have to be in a sort of playful mood for this one. But for me, it struck all the right notes and was really an elevated experience. Occasionally you play a game that's sort of operating on a level that causes real delight, and that's what happened here for me. When we finished this game and had this interesting epilogue ending, it felt like a magical experience. But I don't want to set expectations too high because that you're not guaranteed to have that experience here. I think some people might not have fun. For me, a 10 out of 10. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this box here, the experience box. The idea behind this box is fantastic. What is it? It's the idea of having a legacy campaign add-on that would tie together the narrative, the story of all of the Time Stories Revolution boxes. It's clear it was created with an eye towards there being at least 9 or so individual Time Stories Revolution boxes. It looks like we may only get 3. That already seals the fate of this box. But there's lots of other reasons why it's a really terrible failure. And we're going to look into them and see if we can understand what's gone wrong here. Was it fixable? But we do need to say that what it's trying to do is great. It's trying to add a little legacy campaign. Basically, in this box, you're developing the characters of the time travelers who are inhabiting the bodies of the people in these other games. So I think I've kept almost entirely spoiler-free in my review of the individual boxes. But I'm going to be more willing to give some spoilers here a little bit as we look inside this box. So I think if you really want to play this, well, I don't think I'm going to spoil much. You can get this box for $10 now on Amazon. It's really, I think, makes the experience worse. I do not recommend you get this box and play it. For $10, you could get it and try it, see if you have a different experience than I do. No real harm. But for me, we played this once, and then we put the cover on and said, I never want to see this again. Love the idea of it, but hate the implementation. And we're going to talk in detail about why. But even if it was working great, you should know that because the future of this system is very much in doubt, and it's almost inconceivable that they would produce enough Time Stories boxes to let you actually get anywhere in this system it's almost inconceivable. So really, you're not going to be able to play this. And in fact, they haven't created much of the content for this box. It's web-based, and if you try to go there now, you just get page non-existent. So I don't think there's any way to actually use this box much. But we're going to talk about it. All right, so how do you play this box? Let's get out the components. Let's look at them. All right, I still haven't given you any spoilers here, so you don't even have to worry about that, even if you do care about that. All right, so the idea of this box, the experience box, is that you could play any of the Time Stories Revolution standalone boxes. It doesn't work with regular Time Stories, just Time Stories Revolution in any order. That doesn't matter. Those are sort of like side stories, and then in this experience set, there's one continuing story while you upgrade your characters. So I showed you when you play one of these boxes, you choose a receptacle, a character, a person with a personality and a name that you're going to be playing. Well, this is the meta level one step backwards. Here you pick the science fiction character that you really are while you're inhabiting the bodies of the game. So you've got these 4 characters. Again, each person picks one, and they're supposed to keep that through the entire series. Each one has some different skill levels. These are not skills you use in the games. They're meta skills that you use in this overarching thing. And these boards are just places for you to put your cards. They've also each got an upgrade path of skills that deal with skills in this deck. So each character has their own deck of cards. And these decks of cards, let's just get out for the 2. They actually have a deck of cards for skills. Then they have a deck of weaknesses. Weakness cards. Okay, so let's just get it out for a couple of these people. Okay, maybe I'll put these 2 away. All right, so you've got a branching tree, a tech tree. As you upgrade, you can get these skills. And you would choose when you get a chance to upgrade which skill you want. Again, because there are never going to be 8 boxes, you'll never make it very far here. Even if you got one of these per thing. But these skills are sort of meta rule-breaking skills for the game. So if we just look at this, look at some of these skills, there are things like support another agent even when you're not supposed to be standing by. So these are all things like add +1 or -1 to the value of a green test. So basically these are all the skills are ways you break and make more fiddly the rules in the normal boxes. And if you assume that these standalone boxes are balanced, you can see the challenge that the designers had to encounter for this campaign system. Each of these rules are tiny little annoying ways to break the rules in the standalone boxes. But to keep them balanced, this game also introduces a separate deck of punishments, of weaknesses. And in fact, it's much easier to get these weaknesses than these benefits. What are the weaknesses? They're more little changes to the rules, fiddly, annoying changes to the rules that balance out the skills so that basically they're always a wash. I mean, that's the balance that has to be done here. These standalone boxes are already difficult to balance. But when you add this, where you're getting as you go, increasing little new fiddly modifications that you have to remember to the rules, then you've also got to add these little modifications that make the game more unpleasant. Like some of these rules are things like, well, if you would normally be able to choose a location to go to, now you can't. Or you can't assist with this kind of test. So each player is getting multiple weaknesses and skills that each of them change the tiniest amount of the little odd one-off rules while playing. So every time you're playing the base game, each person has like 2 or 3 modifications to the game rules that cover only specific odd circumstances. Each of your 4 players has 2 or 3 rule tweaks that don't make the game more enjoyable, but now do these little extra bookkeeping fiddliness that you have to deal with. It's really, really unpleasant and adds a lot more stuff that you have to try to keep in mind. And strategizing around it, I don't think that's going to be much of I don't think there's much of a role for strategizing. I just think it's just more busy work, taxing to your memory instead of having this pleasant exploration. Now everyone has slightly different little extra tiny rules. And these weaknesses are oppressive. They're very feel-bad elements. So the idea sounds fun, building up your character. In practice, most of what you're doing, though, is giving your character punishments. Okay, so that's a huge chunk of it. Now, what I haven't even covered, which is the separate little chunk of it, again, there's a real common flavor here for sort of being oppressive. Okay, there's all these skills. Here we have 8 different skills that as a group you can have. How are these skills used? They're purely used when you do tests that you have to do at the end of each mission. And the level difficulty of the test has to do with where you are on this threat thing, and where you are on this threat thing has to do with how well you do on these tests and how well you do at the end of each mission. So one of the things that they're trying to do, which is a welcome idea, is they're trying to motivate you doing well while you're playing each of these standalone boxes, because the score, instead of now just being a score that says, oh, you did very well because you didn't use too many of these crystals, now those crystals get given to you as resources to spend on your upgrades or to get rid of weaknesses. We've played all of these boxes. We never had much at the end that we could spend. So these cards have some nice looking art on them. Fun little, looks like a little graphic novel where you're hearing about things, but they almost all have the same flavor. Let's just look at the flavor, look at how these actually work. There's some nice art, but what really happens here? It just tells you have to test this skill and you have to get between a 6 and a 7. That's what all of these have this flavor of. Test this skill, specific skill. There's no way to know what skills you're going to need for these tests. And these skills are things that your players bring. And occasionally while you're playing one of these standalone boxes, you might get given someone that bumps up a little bit of skill. So you get this card, you're like, oh wow, this person's going to join our team in this campaign. But really all it means is that you're bumping up this particular skill value by 2 points. None of the skills have any thematic, real narrative element to them. And what do you do with all these tests when you get this test that you have to say you have to reach, you have to test this thing and you have to get between a 5 or a 6? Well, you play this little mini game, this very annoying mini game that you have very little control over, where you shuffle these cards and you take them out and you start lining them up. And there are all these convoluted rules. Rahdo has a big long video where he actually talks through these. Amazingly, somehow he manages to explain all the rules for this, but it's a little bit of a push your luck game where you're bringing out these cards, you're trying to get as close to the exact score that the test is. So if the test is to get a 6, well, here you've got a 7. You can pay to throw away a card and get out a new card. If you get the skull, it's an instant loss. If you go over it, it's only a little bit bad. If you go under it, it's only a little bit bad. If you get it exactly right, it's good. You don't have that much control over it. It's a pretty annoying, busy work, very abstract thing here. It's very punishing. It feels like most of what happens here is you get punished a little bit or a lot. And that's, you play this little game, you get these weakness cards. It's a very unpleasant, completely without any theme, atmosphere, nothing about it feels like it's exploration and storytelling. It couldn't have been more unpleasant, more fiddly, and the ending of all of it doesn't feel like it's in your control. It doesn't feel like it has anything to do with anything. And the rewards in terms of skills and weaknesses is all unpleasant. So in the best of cases, it's just annoying. In the worst of cases, it's very annoying. Then there's another little element here, which is after each mission, you're supposed to scan one of these cards. So really, the first 3 missions are the only ones that actually exist. These, if you try to scan these, a QR code in your tablet, they just go to pages that don't exist, and probably will never exist because they're probably not going to make more content. So you scan this one at the end of your first mission, this one at the end of your second mission, and so on. And there's a little storyline here. Now, it's not related really to any of the boxes. It's a separate meta storyline, science fiction future storyline. There's a little bit of an attempt to have a little bit of branching story here. When you scan one of these, it might say, oh, this has happened. You've discovered some item. What do you want to do with this item? Do you want to destroy it or use it? So there's a little bit of a branching narrative story. Remember, it's written so that you could play these boxes in any order. So it's not really connected to these boxes. If you're very invested in this world, maybe it's interesting. To me, it felt very disconcerting, very disjointed because it has nothing to do with the boxes. It didn't do anything for me, and the knowledge that it's never going anywhere, nothing much happens by mission 3. So it doesn't work. But you could imagine if there were 9 of these boxes, maybe as you kept playing, since these boxes are fun to play, maybe there would be an overarching story. But remember, because it doesn't know what order you're playing anything, it can never really do anything that would modify the storyline in any of these boxes. And I think what we're seeing here is the failure of this ambitious idea. And I think we can see why it's not gonna be able to be made to work. And I think as laudable as this idea is for an optional campaign add-along that could be played in any order and played after you've played these, is too steep a hill to climb for these designers, for any designer. And really, I think they would be much better off building into the system from the start a campaign idea. You could absolutely see how you could make these boxes so that you were supposed to play them in a specific order, and there were some campaign legacy elements that each box could introduce as you play, and a continuing storyline. This idea of having this separate, independent campaign legacy thing that doesn't know what order you're going to play the boxes and so can't connect and it has to be so disjointed isn't going to work. And the attempt to build in this little mini game here, that's also doesn't work. I think it would make much more sense if each box had its little beginning storyline that incorporated this stuff, and ending storyline that maybe incorporated some sort of tablet or choose your own adventure element to it, and some sort of skill. Maybe, I mean, we've already got skills in each box that each character brings with it. These just are confusing and are painful to try to keep track of. So I don't think there was a real way to make this work, honestly. I mean, I give them credit for trying something this ambitious, but I just don't think it was ever going to be able to be made to work. Final thoughts on Time Stories Revolution, the series. A very ambitious evolution of Time Stories. For my money, much better than the original Time Stories. It's a shame they haven't been producing more of these boxes. I think they're masterpieces. They are divisive. Not everyone is going to love them, but for a long-form exploration narrative game, it really scratches an itch for me. I think Midsummer is genius, but all three of the standalone boxes are great. They can now be purchased very cheaply, some of them for $10 or so. I do think you have to just accept that sometimes you're going to get into situations that you're going to get punished for no fault of your own. But if you embrace the adventure-y elements here, I think you can have a great time, especially if you like this sort of meta fourth wall time travel stuff that's woven into these games. The experience box was never going to work. It is terrible. I think you should avoid it. I do love the idea of campaign legacy stuff. It's just not really playable in this form here, in my opinion. If you burned out on Time Stories, I do think it's worth giving this a try. They are separate beasts. They do play differently, but these are very high quality. The art is beautiful. The playfulness here is welcome. This is very deftly handled stuff. I do think, especially at the price, you owe it to yourself to try one of these if you haven't already. Which one to start with? You can play these in any order. I think maybe start with the Hadal Project. Makes sense to me. I think Midsummer Night, which for me was the really apex of this experience, is more hit or miss. You could find that unpleasant. If you like Cthulhu and supernatural stuff, then Cavendish is a safe bet. I think the people that are likely to get the most out of this are people who like the adventure games stuff, like sort of choose your own adventure, but are interested in a longer, more strategic game with a little bit of resource management, push your luck. To me, it really does scratch an itch, and I really do hope that they make more of these boxes. But even more, what I really hope is there's a real vision here and ambition in the design of these games. I would love to see another iteration of the Time Stories systems, maybe with an eye towards fixing the combat stuff and making that more in line with the rest of the game system. All right, you can watch our playthroughs of all of these, including our first playthrough of checking out the experience box. You can see how unpleasant it really was if you're curious. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Time Stories Revolution system, how it compares to Time Stories, especially if you played both. There are lots of people who were big fans of the original Time Stories, and those people are divided into the camp of people that like Time Stories Revolution and people who feel like it took a little bit away from the system. I would love to hear your thoughts. I'm very curious how others encounter this set as a whole, and I'll see you on the next video.